Welcome to A Theology of Holy Resistance. This is a podcast dedicated to exploring important ideas in the Christian tradition that are dedicated to the protection of democracy, the uplifting of the oppressed, and the preservation of Christian humility in an era and an age when these virtues are being forgotten in the American population. I'm your host, JT Martin, and I'm excited to launch this project with all of you. Thank you. And I think we're good. Okay, so I completely forgot to ask you how you pronounce your last name.
No worries. It's so Callie Coffin Friels.
Okay. I am joined by Callie Cawthon Friels. We are kind of having an off-the-cuff discussion, minus like 10 minutes of pre-discussion on a topic that I think is really necessary and really applicable to not only congregations that are allies, but also to the lives of queer Christians and queer persons of faith, really of any tradition, um, who are in the United States or in other regions of the world where they're able to get access to this media, um, on queer spirituality as an act of political resistance. I There's not really a greater introduction that I could give to that other than this is an important topic. It is a convoluted and complex topic um, that is just starting to really develop some teeth in ministry and the academy. And so, with that being said, I will turn it over to Pastor Callie and let her um, kind of jump into her perspective, where she's coming at from this, and kind of how her ministerial and authorial work have kind of influenced her approach to this conversation.
And thanks so much for having me on, JT. I'm really excited to engage in this conversation. So I think for me, both as a pastor and as a writer, in the past several years, I've just been really, I don't know, gotten tired of so much of the conversation around queer faith that just stems from queer apologetics, right? Like defending my right to exist, my right to worship God, my right to take up space in churches. Um, and I'm so tired of just starting conversations around faith with let's dissect the clobber passages. Which I mean, I've also done that. You know, I wrote a book about the clobber passages and talking about if we start from they're not homophobic, actually, what do they have to teach us? You know, I'm more interested in the constructive conversations. Um, and that's where I try to come from. Some of the work that I write in the back of my mind is very much some of the pieces you'll notice, like on my Substack and whatnot. It's okay, I'm writing this for other queer Christians who are trying to figure out what does an authentic spirituality look like to me. Sometimes it is more geared towards allies, where I'm just like, y'all need to get it together. And so I hope no matter like who I'm speaking to at the time, it still comes across as pastoral. I'm very much committed to the belief that God desires for our flourishing. And so these systems of oppression that we get caught up in, whether it's, you know, patriarchy or Christian nationalism or homophobia or like any of the isms, ultimately they harm all of us. Because I
Mm-hmm.
believe, you know, the spirit of God resides in you, the spirit of God resides in me. I can't hurt you without also hurting the spirit of God in me. Like we're too interconnected for that. At least
Yep.
that's how I view it. So is that
Got
a
it.
good introduction for you?
No, that's perfect. That's fine. So for those of you who listen slash read my work, you know that I am on Uh, I think what's pretty cutting edge in queer theology right now, I do a lot of my work on alternative sexualities. We're getting ready to launch a kind of 10-part series looking at a theology of sex and fetish that uses both consent and flourishing as the foundation. And then I also do a lot of work on Christian nationalism and the history of American evangelicalism. Um, I've got a number of different projects that I'm kind of spear pointing and kind of working on in that space. And so that's kind of me. And so for those of you who are new, I'm finishing up my master's degree. I'm either going to be starting PhD work in the fall or finishing up a pre-doctoral year of thesis writing um, starting next fall. And I'm a former Southern Baptist, former hyper Calvinist. I think there are still some Calvinistic edges to my thought, but I'm very Wesleyan at the same time. I mean, I'm waltzing through higher education potentially with both a undergrad degree from a Methodist institution and my first master's from a Methodist institution. So I can't escape Wesley as much as I like Calvin sometimes and hate him at the same time.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so I am denominationally homeless. I have flirted with Episcopalians, the Disciples of Christ, the Alliance of Baptists, the Cooperative Baptists, the Unitarians, the United Church of Christ. I've flirted with just about every progressive branch out there. And at least half of them say they want me. So we'll see where we end up in 10 years from now. Um, but yeah, so we're here to talk about queer spirituality as an act of political resistance. I think that one, I think what you get at is really important in this topic. Because we have both this difficulty of, you know, when we're addressing the community that in some cases denies the existence of certain queer populations, you almost have this apologetic impulse to defend the right to existence. Um, and I think that's something that a lot of queer Christians and queer persons of other faiths struggle with within their own traditions. Um, and I think that there's also this need to say, okay, so many people have already done this work. We need to move on to the next questions. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where you and I are for a lot of what we do. We've done that work, we've set that to the side. It's part of a legacy we're now building on.
Mhm.
And so I think that part of it, I think this conversation naturally kind of splits into two categories. You have the, you know, addressing the wider, you know, network of affirming churches that include allies, that include queer and non-queer pastors and ministers and theologians, both in and outside of the academy. And then you also have this kind of conversation that's happening to queer Christians and queer persons of faiths just in general. And so I think that there's those two conversations kind of bleed in and out of each
Mhm.
other. And so to kind of maybe help cut through some of that mess, I think that the starting point for our conversation, minus kind of this introductory material, is just kind of this question of how does queer spirituality um how does queer spirituality function in a life of faith that engages political resistance? So not necessarily
Mm.
looking at queer spirituality as an actual act of political resistance. I think that's the next part. I think the first
Mhm.
part is understanding what queer spirituality does and accomplishes within a larger faith that engages political resistance. I think a really
Mhm.
good example of this is Marcella Althus Reed. She's lauded as kind of the mother of queer theology. She's, I think, the first out bisexual theologian. Um, and I mean, I think that's a lot of. I think she addresses a lot of that second question on queer spirituality and theology as an act of political resistance. But I also think that she just does a lot about what queerness is in a faith that does resistance. And so,
Mhm.
um, is it safe to assume that we've both read at least some of her work?
Yes, it is absolutely safe to assume. I
Okay,
need to read more of her work, but I've read some.
okay. Then I think maybe starting there, starting with this consideration of faith that does political resistance and how queer spirituality fits into that picture.
Mhm. I think, and I think to me, the way I'm hearing your question is kind of like, how is queer spirituality a primer, right? Before the
Hmm.
action that we do in the public square. And I think in a lot of ways, queer spirituality forces, at least talking for me personally, and I hope for spirituality, Christian spaces at large, um, it forces you to be more honest. Like a queer spirituality
Hmm.
forces you to be incredibly critical and to investigate, to really interrogate what it is you believe and why. Because that is so much of what being queer is. I remember taking for granted so much of like when I was a kid, when hormones happen and people start experiencing feelings, romantic feelings. Um, I did not experience that the same way that my close friends did, but I never took the time to really interrogate why until I was older. Um, and so being forced to interrogate those things, of course, leads you to interrogate other things like, the system of patriarchy. Is this actually beneficial for human flourishing?
Hmm.
Where are the pitfalls in all of this? Right. So I
Yes.
think like that idea of queering things, subverting the whatever the hegemonic structure is, that starts with queerness, and that doesn't necessarily mean like you have to be queer in order to do that.
Yeah.
But I think those of us who are in the LGBTQ plus community are kind of more primed for that, just because that's so much of our lived
Hmm.
existence day to day.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right on the money there. I think thinking about queer spirituality as a primer is really good language. I think that, something I would add is that when we are queering things, when we are doing these subversive critical analysis, I think that we're also demonstrating the importance of one, honesty, authenticity, and perhaps even more fundamentally, a perception that um our our words, our actions, and the way we operate as individuals is a contributing or diminishing factor to the flourishing of our communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. I think that individuals in the queer community, because of our lived experiences, are kind of forced to gain an understanding of that through the acceptance of queerness and through the cultivation of authentic expressions of self, a more intimate understanding of that reality, um, than um, other individuals in the cultural majority. And something I want to be careful of here is I want to avoid the isolation of queer liberation from the other liberation traditions. I think this is something that our discipline often struggles with.
Mhm.
Because, you know, I'm white. I like that I'm as white as a cracker. And and I think that when I'm talking about queer theology, there is a tendency to um there's a tendency to neglect to mention that other communities also go through this experience from a different lens or sometimes through multiple lenses. And that's where I think um whether you want to call it intersectionality or you want to use an older womanist term like overlapping spheres of oppression, like that's very, very real. And so
Mhm.
it also makes these conversations more complicated, but I think that complexity is worthwhile to mention because I think what we're talking about is that there are that different marginalized communities in the context of theology and religion offer a perspective that cultivates an understanding of flourishing and compassion that cannot be understood without their voice and without their contribution. And that
Mhm.
individuals in marginalized communities, and in particular for our context and our conversation, queer Christians and queer persons of faith in our audience contribute to that conversation as well because of our lived experiences. And I think that that is what motivates political resistance in the lived Christian faith is that maybe I'm going out on a limb here as an academic and I can't say this, with the 30,000 citations that's required, but that's what podcasts are for. Um, I don't think Christianity functions as a liberative theology and liberative religious practice for the individual and for the community unless it is operating from the margins.
Yes.
And so the very from that perspective then the very nature of the Christian faith as a lived practice and theology becomes something that is inherent, or at least becomes something that necessarily opposes oppression, whether it is politically developed or not. And I think that's
Mhm.
also maybe a complicating factor. Um, is that when we talk about political resistance, we tend to get lost in the success of the civil rights movement and forget the vision of the civil rights leaders.
Yeah.
I think the best example of that is looking at MLK's Where Do We Go From Here? I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read that book or not in any close detail, but one of the things that's like astonishing is that so many people claim MLK and reference the civil rights movement, but don't have an understanding that he called for the direct abolition of poverty and these systemic injustices as prerequisites to the flourishing of society. And so civil
Mhm.
rights were an avenue, not an end. And I think
Right.
that that's a really, really important conversation is that when we're talking about political resistance, and maybe the conversation we're touching on is really about cultural resistance and resisting the mechanisms of culture that diminish flourishing, of which politics can be one.
Mhm. Yeah, because I think too, like the way that we engage as political agents, right, in our society is heavily influenced by what that cultural paradigm is. So I think that that absolutely makes sense that it can be a response to the culture in which we find ourselves. And I think too, like all the points that you were making about intersectionality or overlapping spheres of oppression is so critical to this conversation because one thing that I think like that we see particularly in white queer spaces is that we believe that our history is so short, right?
Yeah.
That like it's maybe further back a couple of decades before the AIDS crisis, and then that's it. Queerness is very new. I was having a conversation with someone in my church recently. Actually, it is like, well, all this pronoun stuff is new to me, right? Like, you know, any gender outside of male, female is all new to me,
Mhm.
and it was just like at first I got a little upset. And then I had to stop myself and remind myself that
Yeah.
it's not their fault that their history was taken from them. You
Yeah.
know, you think about so many different indigenous cultures and aboriginal cultures where they had multiple expressions of gender um, and whatnot. It's just when we see the intersectionality of it and we see like the Mahu people in the Pacific Islands, or we see like the
Hmm.
different spiritualities, not spiritualities, sexualities and gender orientations in Native American history and
Yeah.
whatnot, like we see that queer history is as long as human history. So with if we don't engage in that intersectionality, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle, a huge piece of the conversation, and
Hmm.
so much wisdom.
Yeah.
And how do we engage in this political sphere? Because they experienced similar challenges as well. Um, so that's my little soapbox on that. I'm so glad you brought up the intersectionality bit.
Yeah. Um, and so I think to summarize kind of this first question, right? This understanding of queer spirituality as a primer. First, I think that maybe we would both be in agreement that um queer spirituality is kind of at its core an expression of three things, and there's you can break this up a number of different ways, but I'm gonna operate for three. Um, One, you have an expression of the flourishing self in flourishing community. I think you have the expression of um, the pursuit of flourishing. And then three, I think something that a lot of queer religious persons struggle with articulating in queer communities outside of their religious spaces is how their queerness is an expression of worship
Mm,
of God.
mhm,
And I think that those three expressions are the kind of thing that queer spirituality thrives in and expresses and motivates. And I think as a result of those things, you end up necessarily participating in this vision of Christianity as something that operates from the margins, which is
mhm,
which I also think is part of the reason why white queer spaces are so incredibly complicated inside the church because you have you have the you have the white non-white difficulty and the systems of oppression that operate in that space. Then you have the queer non-queer spaces and systems of oppression, and so you have this like really awkward situation where when you step inside of a church context in which the majority of people are white and you're queer, you have one level of experiencing, you know, a Christianity from the margins. But the minute you step into a primarily queer Christian theological and ministerial space, all of a sudden the power dynamic shifts and you're
Right.
no longer operating potentially from the margins. You're operating as someone who has the power and is having to either lay that power down in those spaces or leverage that power for the uplifting of other voices. And I think that for myself, and because I'm only 25, I think that for myself and for a lot of my peers who operate in these spaces, that is perhaps one of the really difficult realities of taking that next step of trying to understand queer spirituality or these expressions of individual and communal flourishing, the pursuit of flourishing and worship as an act of political resistance. Like once you've stepped
Mhm.
outside the church or stepped into a space that's trying to cultivate these things, the power dynamics and the space from which your Christianity operates completely transforms and changes. And
Mhm.
how do you, I guess pastorally, how do you respond to those difficulties? How do you, um, what would be your advice to kind of the people who are in my shoes, who are maybe just starting to enter seminary or just starting
Mhm.
to enter the conversations in queer ministry and queer theology, who their, for lack of better terms, their experience of marginalization is limited to the queer experience
Mhm.
because of their whiteness.
Yeah, and I think that that's a conversation that, you know, we need to be having so much more. Because we can get so caught up in talking about what are those overlapping spheres of oppression, right? Without also looking at, well, what are the overlapping spheres of privilege?
Yeah.
I think that there is that intersection in all communities, especially when you bring them together, because you talk about being like, we could also, it's not our space to like host this conversation, but like homophobia in the Black church, right? Big issue, right? Homophobia in conservative white churches, big issue. But then you get those circles to cross pollinate, they're also going to bring in the challenger
Hmm.
case, right? And but there are going to be like black male pastors who have privilege because they're male, and they're going to be white female pastors who have privilege because they're white. But it's just those varying degrees, right? And
Yeah.
so I think remembering that our status as queer people is not just like one big ubiquitous I'm marginalized banner,
Yeah.
right? And I think the advice that I would give um, is listen more than you talk, is one of the first ones. And to diversify your reading list. And the listen
Yeah.
more than you talk, like that. I say that as someone who on a discussion board in my, you know, things that keep me up at night from when I was in grad school. I was taking a class with the amazing Dr. Shanika Walker Barnes. Folks who are listening, if you haven't read any of her work, she's a womanist theologian who is just remarkable and I adore her. I had the privilege of taking a pastoral care with women class with her and reflected on discussion board uh, questions related to engaging with doing pastoral care with women from different marginalizations was the topic for that week. And I had the audacity to talk about how I had lost some of my privilege because my family became broke. And so when I say listen more than you talk, I mean that kind of moment. That was incredibly, egg on face, stupid, arrogant moment.
Yeah.
Um, and in reflecting on those things and growing, I'm probably a decade removed from grad school now. Um, took a lot to. It takes a lot of maturity and time to sit through what are the intersections of my marginalization and my privilege,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
some of that advice is just born out of the practicality of like I was dumb and learned from that. And
Yeah.
part of it is from that deep
Yeah.
desire to really connect with people where they're at.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, no, that does. And I think that's that conversation of overlapping, kind of integrating the conversations of privilege and oppression in intersectionality. I think that's also where there's maybe I think for individuals like me who are on the queer spectrum with regard to gender, some
Mhm.
really weird experiences because the existence of certain types of privilege are a source of dysphoria.
Yeah,
And so, like, navigating that complexity in the context of the spiritual and theological formation of seminary is unfortunately something that I don't think we have a model for. I don't think we
right,
really have that as a like thing. Because I mean, like I've heard stories of trans women in seminary and things like that, but it was like they were at Harvard in the 80s, which was a very, very different environment than even then compared to what, a school like Perkins is now. Perkins
right,
School of Theology at Southern Methodist University, that's where I'm at. Like, I think there's just this, like, not to say that there's not a history to look to, but that there's not a pre-articulated navigation that seminarians can lean on for
right.
navigating those challenges. Um, conversely, I also think that while I can't speak to it, I think there's also a maybe a potential challenge for trans men. I can really only speak to, you know, maybe the white trans men in this potential articulation, but, is there a level of what happens when you've started transitioning and all of a sudden you start being afforded things that are more part of the male privilege dynamic?
Right.
How do you navigate that? um and like these are private conversations, these are hard conversations,
Hmm.
and I don't have answers for them necessarily, but I think that what we've talked about with regard to queer, spirituality as a primer for living political resistance and cultural resistance, I think, those types of experiences are part of what fuel that, because we have to walk through
Hmm.
those conversations. Like that's not, we don't have the luxury of ignoring the complicated experiences that come with
Hmm.
transitions from privilege to oppression or oppression to privilege with regard to the gender journey of expression. Um,
Hmm.
like, admittedly, one of the things that I'm kind of like going through right now is When I present my research at AAR Southwest, it's going to be the first time that I'm presenting as genderqueer. I have always gone very, very professional AMAB to conferences, and this is the first time I'm not going to be doing that in a
Mhm.
significant way. And so, like trying to like, I have no way of like preconceiving of what that experience is going to be. And
Yeah.
I think that I think is something that I wish there were more resources on. I wish that like there was like a little how-to book. But I think my
Mhm.
desire for that is rooted in my experience of white male privilege, where those things are taken for granted in every other context.
Mm.
And so
Mhm.
that in and of itself is like deeply uncomfortable for me. Is that like as I'm
Mm.
going through this journey, I'm realizing that my discomfort is because of my desire for the things that enabled my privilege or were
Mm.
examples of my privilege. And
Yeah.
that is, I think, one of the hardest conversations is like, as we're navigating these privilege and oppression conversations and cultural and political resistance, are the to in this more limited window of a discussion of rights, are we longing for rights that are privilege oriented, or are we longing for the opportunity for equity?
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, like that is such a good conversation. We could spend a whole hour just on that. But yeah, I mean, my first thought would be like, if you're looking for that guidebook, maybe it means you should write it. Just gonna throw that out there. But but it reminds me of this is not a very academic thing to highlight, but a few years ago, Louis Giglio, the pastor of Passion City Church in Atlanta, a big like
Hmm.
CCM megachurch down there, um, was I forget if it was a blog or an interview where he said this. So folks will have to Google fact check that part. But what he said, I remember viscerally because it made me want to vomit. He said that our white privilege is our blessing, um, which
Oh
what
God.
he was yeah, like
Oh.
what he was attempting to get at was, the things that,
Mm-mm.
we call blessing in our lives, like that's what other people mean when they say white privilege, which, ew, gross. But I think that also kind of captures that tension that you're talking about here is this nervousness about presenting authentically who you are to the world, rooted in the comfort that your previous privilege had afforded you, which
Hmm.
potentially also relies on the exploitation of other people.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's a really challenging tension to navigate. I remember um, writing a response to that when it happened, and some folks were grumpy at me and like, "Well, why are people making it about race?" and like da 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 da. And it's like, but it's not making it about race. It's acknowledging that we all are part of these systems
Hmm.
that harm other people. Um,
Yeah.
and so, what are we going to do to help dismantle that? I feel like, there's a responsibility to engage those conversations,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think what we're getting at here is I think something that's really important. And I'm gonna kind of tie us toward Alphys Reed a little bit more directly here. So in
Yeah.
The Queer God, she has a chapter called Queer Hermeneutics, and she talks about the libertine, a kind of epistemology or theory of knowledge that's derived from a concept of the libertine body. Read the chapter. She is notoriously difficult to understand, and so I can only articulate so much before I lose my ability to communicate effectively. But in any case, um, so you have this conception of the libertine body. And well, and one of the things is that she talks about like a necessary component of this is excess. The libertine is excessive. And I think what we're maybe touching on here is that the nature of queer spirituality as an act of political resistance points out the discomfort that hegemonic structures have with perceived excess,
Mhm.
and the harsher critique is that I think in Christian spaces, that excessive presence is with regard to Christian identity. It is
Mm.
this, it is this, we don't want too many people to be able to say that, to be able to claim the Christian identity confidently, because it's in a very literal understanding of the New Testament, and very literal, very discombobulated in other ways, limited. It's supposed to be a small number of people. It's supposed to be the narrow way. And so there is this, I think, there is this instinct to defend that narrative that is naturally at conflict with the queer excessive spirituality that wants to say as many people as can name and uh, as many people as can claim Christ ought to be able to.
Yes.
And so, like, one of the things that I explored in my 30-page required treatise on systematics that I had to write in seminary,
Ooh.
2 semesters of work, baby, 2 semesters. And one of the things I talk about is that, one of these other narratives that we can draw from scripture
Yeah.
is that heaven is like an orgy.
Mhm.
If we treat that seriously, we are forced to contend with the fact that the nature of heaven will be excessive beyond our ability to be comfortable with in
Mhm.
this life, because our understanding of love operates from a scarcity model in the hegemonic culture. And this is
Right.
particularly something that is really, really distinguishable, and you can see it super clearly in the discussions around monogamy versus non-monogamy. The idea
Mhm.
that an individual, because they are not God, has a limited and a finite amount of love. And I think what people are actually meaning as love is emotional capacity
Right.
here. I think that people mistake emotional capacity for love. I think if we were to say that, generally speaking, there is a limited number of people that you can have an emotional capacity for on like a hyper individual basis. Like, these are people that you can recall their birthday, all like major dates in their life, major information about them as a person. I think making the argument that there's a limited number of people that an individual can have that capacity for is one thing. I think the philosophical conception of love as scarce is part of what fuels oppression dynamics. And
Yeah.
so, because it becomes, well, how do I defend this person or these people that I love? Instead
Mm.
of recognizing I have a limited emotional capacity, these are the people that are inside that emotional capacity, but I'm obligated to love and have commitment to the flourishing in various types of relationships to everybody.
Hmm.
And that really rubs against some of the conceptions of monogamy that are out there,
Hmm.
especially to highlight, recent politics, especially, somebody like J.D. Vance's application of the Order of Loves from Augustine and the Catholic
Yeah.
tradition. I think that I think that what Augustine is articulating is that it is again this discussion of emotional capacity. I think this is one of the benefits of the psychological age gave us is it gave us a distinction between love and emotional capacity that we didn't have beforehand.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think too, just like bringing in that conversation on excess and what does, excessive love look like?
Hmm.
Because I think it was Marcia Althaus Reed who also likened the Trinity to an orgy that's like,
Hmm.
literally making the love that embodies the earth. And if the Trinity is constantly in love making, how could
Yeah.
there ever be a shortage of
Yeah.
love? Um, and so I think that that is also like distinguishing between like the emotion and the action of love, because I think love is a really action oriented thing, but that's a whole other thing. And the emotional capacity that I have to care for people in my life, and recognizing that that capacity changes from season to season.
Hmm.
I think that that opens up the door to a much healthier, much more honest conversation about what do we mean when we mean romantic relationships? What do we mean when we mean platonic
Exactly.
relationships? And so, yeah, like I'm
Exactly.
100% here on what you're throwing down here. And I think, like I think through in my last church, we had a couple of polycules, and I have a colleague friend in Florida who actually is running a priory out of a church down there. And she is polyamorous as well. And talking through how opening up that capacity and
Hmm.
recognizing the capacity for more um, not only taken a lot more maturity in terms of like recognizing how do I
Hmm.
allocate the capacity I have to these people I've committed myself to, but also just deepened their understanding of community, of
Hmm.
compassion, of
Yeah.
love. And so I think that conversations like these are conversations that the church is going to have more of. I don't think they're going to want to.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but like, my God, what a wealth of wisdom, the church is missing out on.
Yeah. But I mean, that's what it always is. It's, I think the way that I would put it, if we're gonna talk about like political resistance in our current context, um, if I had to put it in like a byline, the church has to learn from the people the government is trying to erase.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because,
So you cut out there for just a second with our uh
okay,
connection. Oh, sorry.
got it. Nope. I think, are we good?
I
Okay.
think we're back.
All right. Um, I think that, again, kind of this snapshot byline, the church has to learn from the people the government is trying to erase or that the culture is trying to erase. And I think that that is a conversation that I think is the entry point to a lot of these other conversations is really changing the conversation from one of um you know protecting our communities in light of scarcity to saying,
Hmm.
what if we reject the concept of scarcity in community? Who
Hmm.
can we learn from if we reject that? And I think
Hmm.
that is a conversation that churches are starting to have. And unfortunately, as we often see in history, those conversations start too late.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe as kind of a closing question to tie a lot of this together, because we went all over the place.
Just a little.
Yeah. Um, you write about queer faith. That's what you write about. That's the title of your Substack. And so how do you see the practice of queer faith and the practice of queer spirituality as either an act of political resistance or acts that people do that entail political resistance, to use a big fancy word from my
Mhm.
philosophy vocabulary?
Yeah. And I think part of this is the tension on queerness that is out and queerness that is closeted. I
Yeah.
promise we're going somewhere with this. Because on the one hand, I think queerness is something that is very visible for a lot of people.
Hmm.
People look at me, I present very masculinely. I also still have, some breast, right? And so
Hmm.
there's that cognitive dissonance. I can't not go out in the world and people assume
Hmm.
anything about me other than I'm queer,
Yeah.
right? And so I think when we think about spirituality as an act of resistance in the public square, it also needs to be visible. There
Hmm.
needs to be a visible protest. There needs to be people visibly advocating for um, rights, visibly decrying all the terrible stuff that's happening right now.
Yeah.
So on the
Yeah.
one hand, queerness is incredibly public, incredibly out, incredibly um, loud in many cases. Um, and on the other hand, only viewing it that way completely marginalizes the people for whom it's not safe to be out,
Yeah.
right? Not that it's safe for anybody to be out right now, but for the people who lose their job, for the people in other countries who would be
Hmm.
murdered, like there is
Yeah.
also an aspect of queerness that is incredibly private. So when we think about bringing that into the public square in terms of our political agency, um, I think that there are also incredibly important private things that need to happen as well. Who are
Yeah.
those private conversations that you could be having? Like, what
Yeah.
are, like, instead of like letting, the stereotypical or at this point, maybe cliche example, racist grandpa at the dinner table, like, what are those private conversations that you could be having to sway the political climate
Hmm.
that maybe you're not having?
Yeah.
So I think there's that tension there between queer spirituality and public or political agency as incredibly
Yeah.
public and also private. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I did a course on presidential rhetoric and political theology this past semester in the fall. So that was a fun this is a fun conversation for that. Um, I think that I think that there's kind of two levels to this. At least at a like major meta theoretical level. And I stay at that level of orbit because I think it gets too complicated for the scope of a podcast conclusion at really anything more minute than that. So, kind of at this like uppermost level, I think that what we see with regard to queer spirituality and political agency is you kind of have two really, really hard choices. You have the choice of letting go of power to force the humanization of your community in the eyes of individuals who would seek to dehumanize you. I think a good example of this is actually, I think a really good example of this. are some of the stories we're hearing about ICE raids where individuals are like intentionally allowing themselves to get arrested because they know they're not going to get deported, but them being arrested by ICE for frivolous reasons forces a degree of humanization for the individuals who are facing deportation. And so there's kind of a twin activity happening there. One, there's a recognition of a privilege that deportation isn't an active threat for them yet, or potentially at all. And then they
Right.
are, and then they're leveraging that reality by laying down their power. That's one of the things that is like in a really weird way, it's really em emblematic or symbolic of the logic of the cross rhetoric in the New Testament. This idea
Mhm.
that the laying down of power is somehow the power by which the world is transformed. I think that we see this. This is something that I write that I'm figuring out how to articulate more fully, but it's this concept of transformative suffering. It's this idea that
Mhm.
you can choose to suffer for the sake of cultural transformation, and that means that your suffering is not responsive to oppression, but rather hopeful for positive change. And so it's this
Mhm.
weird concept for a lot of people of like, how do we understand suffering as something that can possibly be good and connected to flourishing? And I think we see it in these examples
Mhm.
of laying down power as an opportunity to advocate for the humanization of those who are being dehumanized. So that's one. So that's kind of that you have this transformative
Mm.
suffering option at the top level. And that is something that, you know, for lack of better terms, I would almost akin that to putting on the clothes of the individual who is, for lack of better terms, out. You are putting on the clothes of the person
Mhm.
who is out, regardless of whether or not you are queer, regardless of your identity. You're putting on the clothes
Mhm.
of the person is out to force the humanization of those who are out. And so that's the
Yeah.
transformative suffering option. Um, and I think just underneath that, what we have with regard to queer spirituality and political agency is something akin to what we see from the confessing church, the civil rights movement, and a little small village area called Le Chambon in France in World War II. A really good documentary on that community and what happened there is Weapons of the Spirit. But suffice to say, it's a pacifist community descended from the Huguenots that at the like point of ridiculousness for me, the point of ridiculousness for me is that you have Nazis who are intentionally underreporting the amount of Jews in the area to get the French and Nazi regime to ignore the area. And so that's one level that's happening there. And then the second level that's happening there is that you have the headquarters for the French resistance right across the street from the Nazi barracks in the like downtown square.
Mhm.
And like people are visibly Jewish, but there's no arrests, there's no deportations because of the level, because of the pacifist spirituality and the sermons and the public rhetoric. The nature of the public square transformed the oppressors in this
Mhm.
particular context in a really weird way. Now, then
Yeah.
there's complicating nuances, but that's generally kind of what seems to have happened from my understanding of it. And I think that this is what we see both in the confessing church um and in the civil rights movement, is that the nature of the public square forces some kind of change on the oppressors. And
Hmm.
so, really, I think you have two options. At the individual level, you have the option for transformative suffering. At the secondary level, or rather at the systemic level, you have the option of participating, cultivating, and maintaining public squares that will transform the oppressors when they come or as they participate. And
Mm.
so I think the challenge is that there are a lot of people, myself included, who want to cultivate these squares, participate in these public squares, maintain these public squares, who are coming into these conversations from weird places. I'm denominationally homeless. I can't plug in necessarily to the public square represented by like the Alliance of Affirming and Welcoming Baptists or the Reconciling Ministries Network for the United Methodist Church. Like, those aren't spaces that I can just step into. Those aren't public squares that I can step into because I'm denominationally homeless. And I think that really, but I think that's what I would say is that to avoid another tangent that could take us to another half hour. You have transformative suffering, which is the laying down of power from a position of privilege to force humanization and positive change. And then two, um, you have the option of public squares that transform oppressors when they participate. And I
Mhm.
think that a really, really good example of this is um is um I'm trying to think of like a contemporary example. Um
I mean, I've got, not to be a pastor or anything, but I've got a biblical example.
oh, what's your biblical
um,
example?
Jesus with the woman who was caught in adultery. There's, I think,
Yep,
we could have a long conversation about like whether or not she was in the wrong or whatnot, because there is
sure.
kind of like that the potential for like equating like her as doing something wrong to like queer people as doing something wrong, but we don't have time to dig into that. But I think ultimately in that story, Jesus is kind of holding up the mirror to the men who want to stone her.
Yeah,
It's like, if this is how you are going to
yeah,
engage, this is who you're going to be. Do you really want to murder this woman?
yeah,
And so that's kind of like where my brain went. But
yeah. No, no, 100%. I think that's really good. I think I think a really good example in a weird way is I would say is probably seminaries, the moderate to
Mm.
progressive seminaries. Are there issues there? Yes. And universities. Yeah, I'll tie universities and seminaries into this conversation. I think in a weird way, part of what the opposition to higher education is this awareness that there are certain institutions and experiences at institutions that cause people who are part of oppressive power structures to begin critiquing the power structures they come from.
Mhm.
And that is destabilizing. It
Yeah.
destabilizes what Judith Butler, I think, would call a sexed economy or discursive economies. You have like these public spaces of rhetoric and these private spaces of rhetoric when you start critiquing them and you start forcing the intelligibility of the unintelligible to the culture, everything starts to destabilize. Everything about how one understands reality begins to destabilize. And so I think to kind of tie this into what can people do? Like, what can people do? You can participate in transformative suffering, and you can cultivate spaces, you can cultivate conversations. And I think this gets to like, what are the conversations you're not having? Because I think ultimately the conversations that you're having are what form spaces. And there's some academic and sociological teeth to this. It's this concept of conversational plausibility structures. So the sociologist of religion, Nancy Ammerman, who I believe is still alive and is professor emeritus at the Boston University School of Theology, not Boston College, Boston University. She had a book on fundamentalist religious identity that she kind of cultivated this concept. And I use it in some of my work. And it's this idea that the conversations you have form the barriers of what are plausible ideas. And so, one of the things that I've observed when it comes to transforming the public square and like resisting oppression is that the way that you talk about that happening, if you are too pessimistic, you actually end up shooting the effort in the foot.
Mm,
And so there's this concept of revolutionary optimism. It's this idea that yes, things are bad, but they will get better. It is a hope that it recognizes the realism of the present and advocates an optimism for the future. And
mhm.
that is what allows transformation to happen at a rhetorical level. Is you have to get
Yeah.
people to understand how bad things are now, and then you have to communicate a vision. Here's how good things can be. And I think that's what people like MLK did really, really well.
Mhm,
And I think that that's maybe the starting point is
mhm,
cultivating this sense of revolutionary optimism within articulations of queer faith and queer spirituality, in our churches, in our communities, um, and in our online presence, admitting
mhm.
things are bad, but if we work together, we can make them better.
Yeah, and I think, just to offer a really concrete example of what you're describing here, um, the the weekend after the inauguration, after Trump signed that executive order about there only being two genders, or the awfulness there.
Hmm.
Q Christian Fellowship, which is a gathering of LGBTQ plus Christians from all walks of the denominational life, gathered for its annual conference. And during one of the worship services, spontaneously broke out in an a cappella rendition of It Is Well with My Soul. And so the atmosphere that weekend was, it was, a lot of cognitive dissonance. People were crying, people were scared, people were upset, and also people were incredibly joyous in their worship.
Hmm.
And so just like envisioning this world that we can create together. And so it was just like that radical optimism that you're talking about, just in a ballroom at a conference hotel, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do we not only cultivate those experiences, but let other people know that they're happening? Because right now I feel like so many people are just so isolated. And how do we get this community together? Because I think,
Hmm.
just to kind of put a, you know, bow on the conversation, as it were. Um, one of the most radical things about queer spirituality is I don't think it's something that you can do by yourself. You have to be in community in order for it to work.
Yes. Yeah.
And so the moment that we believe that we're alone or that we believe that this is something that I can do by myself, we've lost.
Hmm.
Um, so how do we get that public communal consciousness together?
Yeah. No, 100%. And I think kind of in closing, what I would say is that lesson about community, I think is something we have learned from the Latin and women's liberation movements.
Absolutely.
And I think that that is something that really, I think that that is kind of the space that the next generation of scholars have is uh, who are white queer scholars is doing the work to showcase the foundations and the dependence that has gone unsaid
Right.
on other liberation movements. But with that being said, I think that one, we've had an amazing conversation.
Thank you.
Two, I'm excited to continue kind of building more spaces for conversations like this. The first episode I had a local connection who's a youth minister come on, and we talked about Christianity as a justice-oriented religion in the public square.
Mm.
And that was a fascinating conversation. And I think this one kind of builds tangentially upon it. Um, and so I'm excited for that. And honestly, um, I think that we're modeling the kinds of conversations we're hoping people have. And I
Mhm.
think that's also hard because we're having conversations at one level because we've both done the work to get to a certain level of stance on these. And I think for some people in our audience for this episode, they're maybe just at the beginning stages of that work. And so the
Mhm.
one thing that I would say is that if you are brand spanking new to queer and affirming theology, or you're in seminary and you're coming out at the same time, or you're closeted and you're listening to this really, really quietly with headphones while you're like tucked away somewhere, living and being as authentic as you can be is a starting point.
Mhm.
You don't have to move towards radical performative actions or very, very loud social media presences. In fact, one of the things that is really, really important to understand is that for some people in this current stage, the fact that you're in the closet could be the difference between your ability to significantly help individuals who aren't in the closet and not being able to do that. Um, and so it's kind of that like, um, whoever has the loudest microphone is the people they go after first. So if you don't have a microphone at all, you can help a lot of people.
Right.
And so I think that's just kind of the reality of our situation at kind of the slightly darker level. But there's also hope. There's immense hope because when you look at the long arc of history, there are these really, really dark periods. But the communities that come together in revolutionary hope, they're the communities that help paint a picture of what it means to continue doing good in spite of dark times. And I think in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, that's what both Callie and I are trying to do. We're trying to paint a picture of what it means to do good in spite of dark times. And so, with that, This has been a Theology of Holy Resistance. This is the close of the episode, and I'll see you guys next time.